Who moved the silver compass? The question sliced through the quiet museum like a crack in glass. Conversation stopped. Footsteps slowed. A few tourists turned their heads toward the voice, expecting to see a curator, a historian, maybe someone important. Instead, they saw an old man standing alone in front of a military exhibit. Thomas Walker was 84 years old. His faded brown jacket hung loosely from his shoulders. His boots were worn smooth by decades of use. His white hair peeked out beneath a simple baseball cap. To most people, he looked exactly like the kind of retiree who wandered into places and forgot why he came. The National Military Museum stretched around him in polished silence. Bright overhead lights reflected against spotless glass cases. The low hum of climate control drifted through the vast hall. Inside the displays sat carefully preserved relics from another era. Medals, maps, radios, uniforms, pieces of history frozen behind glass. A young museum employee noticed Thomas standing motionless near Exhibit 14. He had been there for nearly 10 minutes. "Sir," the employee called, "can I help you find something?" Thomas never looked away from the display. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on a single glass case. "Something's missing," he said quietly. The employee smiled politely. "I'm sure everything is exactly where it belongs." Thomas shook his head. "No, it isn't." The employee glanced at the exhibit. It looked perfect. Every artifact was labeled. Every object matched the inventory list. Nothing seemed out of place. "Sir, this collection has been cataloged for years." Thomas slowly raised one finger toward the center of the display. The silver compass was right there. The employee frowned. "The what?" "The silver compass." A nearby couple exchanged amused looks. The employee tapped his tablet and checked the exhibit records. There has never been a silver compass in this display. For the first time, Thomas turned his head. His expression remained calm. "Then your records are wrong." The employee let out a short laugh. "I think I'll trust the records." A few visitors nearby chuckled. Thomas didn't react. He simply looked back at the case. The employee followed his gaze. Dustless glass. Perfect lighting. Historical artifacts arranged with mathematical precision. Nothing unusual. Nothing missing. Yet something about the old veteran's certainty felt unsettling. Thomas took a slow step closer. His eyes narrowed. "The photograph is lower than it used to be." The employee blinked. A second employee approached. Then a third. Soon a small crowd gathered around the strange exchange. "Sir," the second employee said carefully, "this exhibit was redesigned 15 years ago." Thomas nodded. "I know. How would you know that?" Thomas remained silent. His gaze drifted toward an old black and white photograph hanging inside the display. For a brief moment, something changed in his eyes. The polished museum floor seemed to disappear. The bright lights faded. Somewhere deep inside his memory, another place waited. Another time. Another mission. And at the center of that memory stood a small silver compass that was never supposed to be forgotten. Then Thomas spoke again. "Because I was there the day they put it in the case." The crowd fell silent. The silence lingered for several seconds after Thomas Walker spoke. It was the kind of silence that made people glance at one another, searching for someone else to explain what they had just heard. The young employees exchanged uncertain looks. The visitors who had gathered around the display remained still, their curiosity growing with every passing moment. The first employee cleared his throat and forced a polite smile back onto his face. "Sir, I am sure there is some misunderstanding." Thomas did not answer. The employee frowned. "What do you mean?" Thomas slowly raised his hand toward the glass. The man on the far left used to be visible. A few people leaned closer. The employee studied the photograph. It appeared perfectly normal. The frame showed 5 men standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a bright sky. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing looked altered. Yet Thomas spoke with absolute certainty. "That photograph was cropped," he said. "Someone removed part of it." The second employee folded his arms. "Sir, these displays are reviewed by historians." Thomas nodded once. Then they should know better. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd, but they quickly faded. The old veteran was not arguing. He was not angry. He sounded disappointed. That somehow made his words more unsettling. Across the hall, a woman carrying a stack of archival folders paused when she noticed the gathering crowd. Sarah Mitchell had spent the last 3 years working as a museum historian. She was 29 years old, detail-oriented, and known for catching mistakes others missed. She approached quietly, and listened to the conversation without interrupting. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked. The first employee gestured toward Thomas. "He believes part of the exhibit is missing." Sarah looked at Thomas. "And what exactly is missing?" "The silver compass," he replied, "and the story that came with it." Sarah studied his face. There was no confusion in his eyes, no uncertainty, only conviction. "How do you know the story is incomplete?" she asked. Thomas looked at her for the first time. His pale blue eyes seemed sharper than before. "Because I helped write it." Several people exchanged confused glances. Sarah remained silent. Something about the way he said it caught her attention. No hesitation, no exaggeration, just a simple statement. Thomas turned back toward the display. "The compass was never supposed to be the important part," he said. "It was what it proved." Sarah felt a strange chill despite the comfortable temperature of the gallery. "What did it prove?" she asked. Thomas stared at the empty space he believed should contain the artifact. For a moment, the reflections in the glass seemed to drift across his face like distant memories. That someone came back when everyone believed they were gone. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. There was something hidden beneath those words. Something larger than a missing museum piece. Without saying another word, she stepped away from the crowd and headed toward the archives room. Behind her, Thomas remained motionless before the display, as if he had been standing there for years waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. Sarah Mitchell moved quickly through the restricted corridors beneath the museum, her shoes tapping softly against polished concrete floors. The farther she went, the quieter the building became. The sounds of visitors and conversations faded behind heavy archive doors designed to protect decades of history. She reached the records department and signed into a terminal that very few employees ever used. The old veteran's words echoed in her mind. The compass was never supposed to be the important part. It was what it proved. Sarah entered the exhibit identification number and opened the collection records. Hundreds of pages appeared. Acquisition reports, preservation notes, restoration schedules. Nothing unusual. At first, she narrowed her eyes and continued searching. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. A growing sense of unease settled over her. Every reference to the artifact collection seemed strangely incomplete. Entire sections ended abruptly. Certain inventory numbers skipped without explanation. Several photographs carried revision dates that did not match the original records. Sarah opened another file. Then another. A pattern began to emerge. The same missing reference appeared over and over again. A blank space where an object should have been listed. A sentence ending in the middle of a paragraph. A photograph cropped slightly tighter than expected. It was subtle enough that almost nobody would ever notice. Almost nobody except someone who already knew what belonged there. Sarah leaned back in her chair. The air conditioning hummed above her. For the first time since she started working at the museum, she felt less like a historian and more like an investigator. She returned to the photograph from the exhibit. Using archived scans, she located an earlier version stored decades before the latest restoration. Her pulse quickened. Thomas had been right. The image was different. On the far left edge of the original photograph stood another man, partially obscured, easy to overlook, yet clearly present. In the modern display version, he had been removed entirely. Sarah stared at the screen. Why would anyone alter a historical photograph? She enlarged the image. The missing man's face remained difficult to see, but one detail stood out. Around his neck hung a thin chain. Attached to it was a small metallic object. Circular, reflective, familiar. Sarah immediately opened another file. Then another. Finally, she found a faded inventory report dated more than 50 years earlier. Her breath caught. There it was. Silver compass. Item number 47B. Donated by the United States Army Historical Recovery Program. Display authorization approved. She looked again to make sure she had not imagined it. The artifact existed. It had existed all along. Yet every modern record showed no trace of it. Someone had removed it from the official history. Sarah printed the document and hurried back toward the gallery. Above her, sunlight filtered through the museum skylights. Visitors continued wandering between exhibits, completely unaware that the story displayed behind the glass might not be the whole story. As she approached the crowd again, she saw Thomas Walker standing exactly where she had left him. He had not moved an inch. His eyes remained fixed on the exhibit, almost as if he already knew what she had discovered. Sarah slowed her pace. For the first time, she was no longer wondering whether the old veteran was correct. Now she had a different question. If the artifact had been deliberately erased from the records, who had gone to such lengths to make sure nobody remembered it? Sarah stopped a few feet from Thomas Walker and held the printed inventory report in her trembling hands. The crowd around the exhibit had grown larger. Word had quietly spread through the museum that an elderly visitor had discovered something the staff had missed. Visitors whispered among themselves. Employees exchanged uncertain glances. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was beginning to crack. Thomas noticed the paper in Sarah's hand before she spoke. His expression did not change. "You found it," he said. It was not a question. Sarah nodded slowly. The silver compass was listed in the original collection records. Several employees immediately stepped closer. The young staff member who had first approached Thomas looked down at the report. "That cannot be right." Sarah handed him the page. The color drained from his face as he read the inventory number with his own eyes. The artifact had existed. The records proved it. Yet somehow it had vanished from every modern catalog. A tense silence settled over the gallery. Thomas looked back toward the display case. "I told you the story was incomplete." One of the senior exhibit coordinators crossed his arms. "Even if the artifact existed, that does not explain why it disappeared." Thomas remained quiet for a moment. The overhead lights reflected softly across the glass. Maybe someone thought it was easier to remove the evidence than explain what it meant. Sarah studied him carefully. Every answer seemed to reveal less than it concealed. "What exactly did it mean?" she asked. Thomas took a slow breath. The smell of polished wood and climate-controlled air seemed to fade from his senses. His eyes settled on the old photograph once again. "There were 6 names attached to that mission," he said quietly. "Officially, only 5 came home." Nobody spoke. Even the visitors seemed to sense that something important was unfolding. "But the records were wrong," Thomas continued. "One man returned months later." Sarah felt a chill run through her. "The man who was removed from the photograph?" Thomas nodded. "The compass proved it." The coordinator frowned. "How?" Thomas looked at the empty space inside the display. "Because he carried it when nobody expected to see him again." Sarah's heartbeat quickened. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the picture they formed raised even more questions. Before she could ask another one, a voice crackled through a nearby radio. The museum director was on his way. Employees immediately straightened. Conversation stopped. The director rarely left his office during public hours. Yet within minutes, a tall man in a dark suit appeared at the end of the gallery, moving quickly through the crowd. He carried a tablet in one hand and wore a deeply concerned expression. His eyes locked onto Thomas Walker. Then something unexpected happened. The director slowed. His gaze shifted from Thomas to the inventory report, then back again. For the briefest moment, he looked as though he recognized the old veteran. Not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as someone whose name he had encountered somewhere before. Somewhere important. Somewhere buried deep inside a file that had not been opened in a very long time. The museum director stopped a few feet from Thomas Walker. The noise of the gallery seemed distant now, swallowed by the growing weight of unanswered questions. Visitors stood quietly around the exhibit. Employees watched with anxious expressions. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever was happening. The director adjusted his glasses and looked down at the inventory report Sarah Mitchell had discovered. His eyes moved across the page. Then he looked at Thomas again. "Walker," he said carefully. "Thomas Walker." The old veteran nodded once. A strange expression crossed the director's face. Recognition. Not complete recognition, but enough to make him uneasy. "I have seen that name before," he admitted. Sarah immediately stepped forward. "You have." The director hesitated. "Several years ago, during a records transfer project, there was a restricted archive box connected to this exhibit." Sarah frowned. "Restricted by whom?" "That was the strange part," the director replied. "The authorization was never clearly identified." A murmur spread through the crowd. Thomas remained silent. The director glanced toward him. "I remember one specific instruction." "What instruction?" Sarah asked. The director swallowed. "Do not separate the compass from the recovery report." The words hung in the air. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Recovery report?" Thomas slowly closed his eyes. The overhead lights reflected across the glass display case. For a moment, the museum vanished from his thoughts. He was no longer standing among tourists and exhibits. The polished floors disappeared. The climate-controlled air faded away. In its place came the memory of another day. Another world. A humid morning beneath a pale sky. A temporary command tent stood in the distance. 6 young soldiers gathered around a folding table covered with maps and radio equipment. Everything smelled of damp canvas, dust, and coffee. Thomas remembered a silver compass resting near the center of the table. It was ordinary at first glance. Scratched, tarnished, barely worth noticing. Yet every man there knew its importance. Not because of its value, because of what it represented. One by one, the men had signed a field report connected to that compass. A promise, a record, proof that something impossible had happened. Thomas remembered one young soldier laughing as he clipped the compass to a chain around his neck. The same soldier later standing in the photograph displayed inside the museum. The same soldier whose image had been removed. The memory faded like fog under sunlight. Thomas opened his eyes. Sarah was watching him closely now. "You know who that missing soldier was," she said softly. Thomas looked toward the altered photograph. "Yes." "Then why has his name been erased?" Sarah asked. Thomas did not answer immediately. His gaze settled on the empty space inside the display case. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that everyone leaned closer to hear. Because the wrong story became easier to tell. The director stared at him. "What does that mean?" Thomas took a slow breath. His expression hardened for the first time all afternoon. "It means the compass was never the secret." A cold silence settled over the gallery. "The secret," Thomas continued, "was the man who carried it home." The words settled over the gallery like a heavy fog. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the visitors who had wandered into the exhibit out of curiosity now sensed they were standing near something far larger than a misplaced museum artifact. Sarah Mitchell studied Thomas Walker carefully. Every answer he gave seemed to pull another thread from a tapestry that had been hidden for decades. "Who was he?" she finally asked. Thomas remained silent for several seconds. The museum director looked equally tense. Around them, employees pretended to focus on their duties, but every eye remained fixed on the old veteran. Thomas slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Several people exchanged nervous glances. He removed a small folded piece of paper. The edges were worn smooth from age. The paper had been folded and unfolded countless times over the years. Carefully, he opened it. Sarah stepped closer. The director did the same. Inside was an old photograph. Not the one displayed in the museum. This one was complete. 6 young soldiers stood beneath a bright sky. Their uniforms were dusty. Their expressions carried the confidence of men who believed the future was still waiting for them. Thomas held the photograph steady. "This is how it originally looked." Sarah immediately recognized the missing figure on the far left. For the first time, she could see his face clearly. He looked young, ordinary, the kind of person a crowd might walk past without ever noticing. Yet somehow his absence had altered an entire exhibit. "What was his name?" Sarah asked quietly. Thomas looked down at the photograph. A faint smile appeared for the first time all day. Daniel Mercer. The name meant nothing to anyone nearby. No recognition appeared on the faces of the employees. No famous military figure. No decorated public hero. Just a name. Yet Thomas spoke it with a level of respect that commanded attention. "He carried the compass?" Sarah asked. Thomas nodded. "Yes." "And he came back?" Thomas looked toward the empty display case. "Eventually." The museum director frowned. "Then why does every official report say otherwise?" Thomas folded the photograph slowly. "Because when Daniel finally returned, somebody higher up decided the truth created too many questions." The director exchanged a look with Sarah. "Questions about what?" Thomas hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Not fear. Not regret. Something heavier. The burden of remembering. "About where he had been," he said quietly. Sarah felt her pulse quicken again. "Do the archives explain it?" Thomas shook his head. "No, then how do you know?" Sarah asked. Thomas slipped the photograph back into his pocket. His pale blue eyes moved toward a locked hallway at the far side of the museum. A hallway marked employees only. Because the answer was never kept in the archives. The director followed his gaze. A strange expression crossed his face. Recognition. Real recognition this time. As if a forgotten memory had suddenly returned. Then he whispered for words that made Thomas slowly close his eyes. "The lower storage vault." Thomas Walker opened his eyes slowly. The lower storage vault. He had not heard those words spoken aloud in more than 40 years. Around him, the gallery remained silent. Visitors looked confused. Most of them had never heard of the vault. Several employees exchanged uncertain glances. Even Sarah Mitchell seemed surprised. Only the museum director appeared to understand the significance of what he had just said. "I thought those records were transferred decades ago," Sarah said. The director shook his head. "Most of them were." His voice sounded distant now. "Not all of them." Thomas stared toward the restricted hallway. Memories stirred behind his calm expression. He remembered the last time he had walked through that corridor. The museum had looked very different then. Smaller, quieter. The exhibits had not yet been modernized. Many of the artifacts still sat inside wooden crates waiting to be cataloged. Back then, the lower vault was used to store items that nobody quite knew how to classify. Objects connected to incomplete stories. Documents that raised difficult questions. Things that did not fit neatly into official narratives. Sarah stepped closer. "What is down there?" she asked. The director hesitated. "I honestly do not know anymore." Thomas gave a faint nod. "Someone made sure of that." The director looked at him carefully. "You knew about the vault." "I helped carry some of the crates into it," Thomas replied. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. The young employee who had originally dismissed him lowered his eyes. The old veteran he had assumed was confused seemed to know more about the museum than most of the staff. Sarah studied Thomas for a moment. "Then whatever happened to Daniel Mercer is connected to those records." Thomas remained silent. Sarah noticed something she had not seen before. The old veteran was no longer speaking with certainty. He was choosing his words carefully, almost as if he were approaching a memory he had spent decades avoiding. The director finally made a decision. "Come with me." Several employees immediately straightened. "Sir," one asked. "Open the lower vault," the director said. The employee blinked in surprise. "We have not accessed that section in years." "Open it anyway." The order spread quickly. Radios crackled. Security personnel moved toward the restricted hallway. Museum staff hurried to retrieve old access credentials. The atmosphere inside the gallery changed completely. What had started as an awkward misunderstanding had become something else entirely. Something nobody had expected. Sarah walked beside Thomas as the crowd slowly followed at a respectful distance. "Do you think the compass is still down there?" she asked. Thomas looked ahead. "Maybe." "And Daniel Mercer?" Sarah pressed. Thomas stopped walking. The question hung between them. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked directly at her. His pale blue eyes carried the weight of half a century. "The compass was hidden," he said quietly. "Daniel was erased." Sarah felt a chill move through her. Before she could ask another question, a voice echoed from the end of the hallway. The vault door had been unlocked, and behind it waited a room that nobody in the museum had entered for nearly 20 years. The heavy vault door groaned as it swung open. A breath of cool, stale air drifted out from the darkness beyond. Dust floated through the narrow beam of fluorescent light, spilling into the room. Sarah Mitchell stepped inside first beside the museum director. Behind them, Thomas Walker moved slowly, his eyes scanning the space with a familiarity that made the younger employees uneasy. Rows of metal shelving stretched into the shadows. Wooden crates sat untouched beneath decades of dust. Faded labels hung from their corners. Some carried dates older than the museum itself. The director looked around in disbelief. "I cannot believe this place still exists." Thomas gave a faint nod. Most people forgot it was here. Sarah ran her fingers across a thick layer of dust covering a nearby crate. Not everyone forgot. The room fell silent except for the hum of old ventilation equipment somewhere deeper inside the vault. Thomas continued walking. He never hesitated. He never stopped to read a label. Somehow he seemed to know exactly where he was going. The employees exchanged uncertain looks and followed behind him. Finally, Thomas stopped in front of a shelf near the far wall. A single crate sat there, smaller than the others. Unlike everything around it, the dust on its lid appeared disturbed. Not recently, but more recently than the rest. Sarah noticed it immediately. Someone opened this. The director crouched beside the crate. A faded inventory tag remained attached by a rusted wire. Most of the writing had disappeared with age. Only a few words remained visible. "Recovery file. Exhibit 14. The director looked up sharply. "This is connected to the gallery." Thomas slowly removed his cap. It always was. Two employees carefully lifted the lid. The hinges squealed softly. Everyone leaned forward. Inside rested a weathered canvas pouch, a stack of yellowed documents, and a small metal box. Nobody spoke. Sarah reached for the documents first. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the top folder. Dozens of pages filled with signatures, reports, and photographs appeared beneath the brittle paper clips. Then she froze. "Director," her voice barely rose above a whisper. The director stepped closer. Sarah pointed toward a name typed near the top of the first page. 6 names appeared on the recovery report. Not 5. 6. Every one matched the original photograph Thomas had carried in his pocket, including Daniel Mercer. The room fell silent. The official record had never been lost. It had been hidden. Sarah turned another page. Then another. More references to Daniel appeared everywhere. Mission summaries, personnel evaluations, witness statements, entire sections that had vanished from the museum archives. The director stared in disbelief. "This changes everything." Thomas remained motionless. His attention was fixed on the small metal box still resting inside the crate. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached toward it. The room seemed to hold its breath. The latch clicked open. Inside, resting on dark velvet, was a tarnished silver compass. Sarah felt a chill race through her body. After all these years, it had been here the entire time. But it was not the compass that made Thomas suddenly go pale. It was the folded letter hidden beneath it, a letter addressed to him in Daniel Mercer's handwriting. Thomas Walker stared at the letter for a long moment before touching it. The vault remained completely silent. Sarah Mitchell could hear nothing except the faint hum of the ventilation system and the soft rustle of old paper. Everyone seemed to understand that they were standing at the end of a story that had been buried for half a century. Carefully, Thomas unfolded the letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. He recognized it immediately. Daniel Mercer. The same steady handwriting from countless reports, notes, and field journals. Thomas began reading silently. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then he stopped. Sarah noticed the faintest smile appear on his face. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Relief. The kind of relief a person feels after carrying an unanswered question for most of a lifetime. "What does it say?" Sarah asked softly. Thomas looked up. The years seemed lighter on his shoulders now. "It says he knew this day would come." The museum director stepped closer. "He left instructions?" Thomas nodded. "For whoever found the compass." He lowered his eyes and continued reading. Daniel had written that the compass should never be displayed as a trophy. It was not valuable because of where it had been. It was valuable because it reminded people that history is made of human beings, not headlines. Near the bottom of the page, another sentence caught Thomas's attention. He read it aloud. "If this letter is being read, then someone finally cared enough to ask why my name disappeared." Nobody spoke. The words seemed to settle over the room like dust drifting through sunlight. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. For years she had studied artifacts, documents, and exhibits. Yet standing there, she realized how easily a person could vanish from history if nobody bothered to remember. Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the compass. The museum director looked around the vault. "We are restoring everything," he said firmly. "The records, the photographs, the exhibit, all of it." Several employees nodded immediately. Nobody disagreed. Thomas looked toward the open vault door. Through the hallway beyond, he could see the distant lights of the gallery where visitors still waited. The empty space inside the display case would not remain empty much longer. Sarah smiled. "You knew exactly where to look." Thomas slipped his cap back on and glanced at the compass one last time. "No," he said quietly. "I just remembered what everyone else forgot." As they walked back toward the gallery, the employees naturally stepped aside to let him pass. The same people who had assumed he was lost now watched him with silent respect. No announcements were made. No speeches were given. None were needed. The truth had done all the talking. When Thomas finally reached the exhibit again, he paused before the empty space inside the glass case. For a brief moment, he imagined 6 young soldiers standing together beneath a bright sky, exactly as they had in the original photograph. Then he smiled and continued walking. Behind him, museum staff began preparing a new display, one that would finally include all 6 names.